Good morning. I'm John Bitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to the Human Progress and Flourishing Workshop. In this series, we bring in scholars from across the country and from NDSU to discuss insights from their research with the NDSU community. Topics focus on innovation, opportunity, and ways to increase individual and societal flourishing. And I'm really excited that today we're joined by one of our own, Dr. Elizabeth Carlson. Dr. Elizabeth Carlson is an assistant professor of political science and a scholar with the Challey Institute at North Dakota State University. She specializes in political behavior, public opinion and survey methods, lab and field experimentation, and the political economy of development in Africa. She is a founding organizer of data-driven development in Africa, an occasional host of behavioral models of politics. She received her PhD in political science from the University of California, Los Angeles. And again, I'm really excited. Elizabeth does a lot of great work for the Challey Institute, and I'm excited that she can show off her work to all of us today and teach us something about development in Africa. And so without any further delay, there will be a time for you to ask your own questions at the end. Let's welcome Elizabeth Carlson.
I actually am not showing off a huge amount of my own work in this, but I'm hoping this will be, if you were at Chris Blattman's talk, if you were at the talk on Wednesday with Magat Wade, this should be a decent follow-up to what it is that we're supposed to do about all of these things. But before I start, I want to actually sort of go on a bit of a tangent, which is it's not clear to me that most people who grew up in the US understand what we mean when we're talking about extreme poverty in an international sense, right? Poverty in this country is not fun. It's a hard life, it's a stressful life, it's a tiring life. But extreme poverty on the international level is another level. And so I want you to think about what you would do. The international poverty line is set at slightly below, well, actually, I think it's now slightly above $2 per, I'm not recording. Oh, goodness, there was all sorts of waving in the back. Okay, sorry. It's set at about $2 a day, which is essentially what people have decided is the amount of dollars that you need to survive until tomorrow. And so I want you to imagine that you work 10 to 12 hours a day. You're certainly working hard. You're earning $2 a day. You live in a community where everyone else around you has a similar income. So you can't just go to a friend and borrow some money to make it through to tomorrow. You also don't have a government safety net. There's no welfare. There's no food stamps. There's no Section 8. There's no one to turn to if you need, if you can't make it. And there's no municipal water or electricity. So you can't just walk onto campus and fill your kettle with water or something like that. Okay. Not only that, that $2 is not really $2. It's however much money you have made that would buy you the same amount of stuff that you could buy in the US for $2. So sometimes people think, oh, $2, I could go to Chad and live like a king. Well, but it's not really $2. Maybe you're earning 15 cents or 50 cents. You're assuming in this case it's $2 and we're talking about US prices. What are you going to do with $2 to survive along with your family until next week? And if you think, aha, I know the answer to this, I'm going to buy rice and beans and eat it. Well, first of all, rice and beans are cheap, but it's about $2 is about how much you need to get enough rice and beans for your calorie needs for a day. But I also would have the question of how are you planning to cook it? You don't have electricity, you don't have water. So on top of your 10 to 12 hour workday, you're going to have to go walk and find water. So I don't know how far you live from the Red River. You're probably going to want to boil that water if you don't want to get a waterborne illness. So you're going to need to collect some fuel while you're down there. I hope no one else cut down the trees already. You're probably going to need to grow some of your own food, which is fairly labor intensive. You need it to survive, but you've already worked a 10 to 12 hour day. You might even think that it's not worth it to work at all anymore, right? That $2 isn't helping you. You're just going to spend your time being a subsistence farmer so that you can at least have enough food. But of course, without cash, it makes it pretty hard to send your kids to school. It makes it hard to go to the doctor. You can't buy oil. You can't buy salt. And I really hope you have access to some land that you can live on and farm, because you're going to need to build your own house. Okay? Because you can't pay rent with $2 a day at US prices anyway. And so this is the kind of poverty that we are talking about when we are talking about extreme poverty. And this is sort of a map of where that kind of extreme poverty, oops, no, it's not a map. It went back to where it was. Okay. A map of the rate of this kind, the head count, essentially, the proportion of the population, I bet I'm too far over, that meets this threshold in various countries, various regions around the world. And you can see the US is actually hitting at about 6 to 12% of the population has an income less than $2 a day. But remember, those folks have access to the safety net, right? Or potentially have access to a household where other people are supporting them. When we get into the continent of Africa there, you can see that there are a lot of countries that are in sort of these darker colors here, where 40 to 90% of the population is living at this level of extreme poverty, where Magat on Wednesday said it was life and death. And she was talking about people being desperate and getting in a boat and capsizing. But it's life and death in a different way, which is if you can't afford sufficient food and you can't get enough sleep because you're constantly working and you can't afford medical care, you're not going to live very long. And average life expectancy in a lot of these countries is quite low. This is the kind of poverty that literally kills. Okay. And while extreme poverty has been going down in the world overall, which is a really good thing, the fact is that the regions in which it's been declining are different, right? And so you can see here that the bulk of the decline since 1990, which is, by the way, a very fast change, the bulk of the decline has been in East Asia and the Pacific, specifically China. There's also been a decline in South Asia, which is mostly India. But this is Sub-Saharan Africa here, which is Africa south of the Sahara Desert. So not Morocco, not Algeria, down below the desert, is not only not declining, it's actually going up. Because while poverty is dropping, the share of poverty is dropping, which is good. The population is growing so quickly that you actually have more poor people now, more people living at this level of extreme poverty now than you had in 1990. Okay, so this is not how we want this to go. All right. Just to sort of a little bit off of what, just to reconcile what Magat was saying with some of what I'm showing. It turns out that Sub-Saharan Africa has the highest share of the population that is self-employed. And when we think about self-employed, we usually think about entrepreneurs, people starting businesses. But in Africa, that's not usually what we're talking about. So here we have top performers, which are the wealthy, about 10% of the population consistently across African countries. We have constrained gazelles. She calls them cheetahs. Elsewhere in the literature is called gazelles, people who could start a business, who could be among a top performer if they weren't facing credit constraints or transportation issues or weird people putting up regulations to ask for bribes, is about a quarter of the population. But the vast majority of people who are self-employed in African countries are survivalists. They're self-employed in the sense that they don't work for wages because they're too busy at home trying to grow enough food to survive. This is not an income generating type of self-employment. This is a survival generating type of self-employment. Okay. This type of poverty is incredibly hard to get out of as an individual, right? Because what you need to sort of improve economically is you need to invest somehow, right? So maybe you want to be more productive as a farmer. Well, maybe you could go and you could buy some technology, or you could take a class. How are you going to do that? You have no surplus capital. You're using everything you have to survive. And you're also already working 18, 20 hours a day. With what time or money are you going to invest in your own productivity? There aren't a lot of wage jobs going around anyway, but even if you wanted them, you might need skills that you don't have and you can't get when you are literally living day to day. Okay, so extreme poverty means you have nothing to invest. No investment, you have no growth. Now we're in this cycle, at least for individuals. So how would you get out of this kind of trap? Well, resources, surplus capital of some kind is going to have to come from somewhere. There's going to have to be a source of surplus capital that's injected into your life somehow by someone who's not currently in this trap. It can come from lots of places. It can come from aid and charity, shoes, food aid, people paying your kids' school fees, whatever it is. It can come from foreign investment, domestic investment should also be here, right? You could get a job that pays you a wage more than $2 a day. But a lot of that would also come from a firm that comes in internationally and has a lot of money and can, like what Magat is doing, right? That's foreign investment. Or government redistribution, where the people at the top, these folks up here, are taxed and money is sent down, money and resources are sent down to the survivalists. It doesn't have to be money, it could be time. Maybe we could subsidize childcare, so at least you have time now to work when you're not watching your kids. Maybe we could build you a road so that you can get your goods to market, or we could build you a water pump so that you're not spending 3 hours a day going to look for water. And here is where politics comes into play. And this is sort of what I would call political poverty. There's a lot that governments can do or not do to make it more or less likely that we'll see this kind of capital getting down to the poor, right? And there are lots of things that governments can do very, very wrong. So we learned from Chris Blattman, first of all, that conflict is often a leadership failure. There's a lot that politicians and leaders could do to prevent war, and they choose not to for various reasons. And we also learned, and if you didn't learn it from him, it's sort of straightforward, that war is just about the worst thing that can happen to your economy, right? I mean, things are being destroyed, people are being killed, people are fleeing their farms. It's a terrible economic outcome. And we can see that conflict events are just all over the place. I don't know if any of you would happen to know what this is, but this is the town. This is President Mobutu of former Zaire. Do you know who I'm talking about? This is his hometown. And in the 1970s, he spent, I don't know how much money to produce this like brilliant state-of-the-art town in the 1970s, just for the town where he grew up in. And you can see like this road, this road still is just, that's a beautiful road, oof, right? I'm sure this building was at one point spectacular. I don't know how much he spent, but I'm pretty sure you could have bought a lot of vaccines for that. Right? And so this is sort of a very clear illustration, but it's symptomatic of a larger pattern of misallocation where leaders who aren't acting on behalf of their populations are giving money to giving resources, targeting resources towards certain members of the population, certain groups in the population that probably that's not the best way to be using resources, not the most productive way to be using resources at all. Of course, we also are dealing with corruption. These are just some headlines. I like to re-up my headlines every year. So these are just from this year, I think. 2022, 2021. That's a lot of money missing. In addition to revenue just disappearing and going into someone's pocket instead of being put into some sort of useful investment, this is also what Magat was talking about. So she's talking about all of those obstacles being put in her way and people citing legislation from 1963 or whatever it was. Maybe this is about labor protections and ILO and whatever else, but most likely that guy who was setting in place all these regulations and being absolutely gleeful that he personally got to decide whether or not she got a business license, what he was doing was trying to extract a bribe from her, right? He was trying to make it so onerous for her to start a business that she would pay him off to stop being difficult, and he would profit and she would get to start her business and everybody wins, except she's not willing to pay a bribe, which is a decision I agree with. And so corruption not only just takes money that could have been invested or redistributed and causes it to disappear, It also makes it very hard for anyone to be willing to start a business, foreign or domestic, because there's just no limit to how much you might be asked to pay in bribes in order to make your business go. And this is actually from an insurance company. It's a insurance company for firms, and they're sort of explaining the rates that they're going to charge you for trying to start a business in a given country. And this is specifically political risk. It's the risk to your business and the risk of business failure that could be due to political causes, like conflict, like corruption, like expropriation, where the government just comes and takes your whole business out from under you, right? And you can see that there are a lot of places in the world that are red and dark orange, but they're concentrated in Africa. Okay? And so this is poverty that is, well, it's economic consequences of political processes, and I would call it failures or dysfunctions. Okay? But these are fundamentally political problems. All right, so we're political, well, I'm a political scientist, I don't know about you, but political scientists are like, great, it's a political problem, we have a political solution. Here's our solution. Our solution is democracy. Because it turns out that people don't like living. This is not a fun place to live, right? If your business, if your business is likely to fail, there's enough stuff going wrong that it's a fairly politically unpleasant place to live. And you probably, as a person, let alone as a business leader, are feeling somewhat insecure about the situation in your country. People don't like corruption. For some reason, there's like an argument sometimes that you hear around that like people in Africa, that corruption is part of African countries' cultures, or that people in Africa are okay with corruption. And that's not true. No one is okay with, no one wants corruption. No one wants to have to pay a bribe to go about their day. That's just a very silly argument. People don't want corruption. They don't want conflict. They don't want their leader building this multi-million-dollar hometown while they don't have running water. People don't want this. And the idea is if we could get leaders who are responsive to their citizens, the citizens will sort of solve these problems for us. And it turns out that anytime you ask a political scientist, well, what's the solution to that? The solution is going to be, well, the people have to do something. It can be very frustrating if you're one of the people trying to do something and it turns out that there's no magic answer except other people joining you to do something. But the only real way that we get political accountability is by people demanding it. Marching, voting. If they have to throw some Molotov cocktails, well, then maybe they'll do that too. I'm not endorsing Molotov cocktails. It's just, that is a form of political participation. All right. If we can get a democracy, the good news is we can get accountability without having anybody to throw any cocktails, because people can just vote for the politicians that they like, who are actually doing things to make their country secure and prosperous. And people in African countries are using they're working hard to get democracy, to use their democracy to try and hold their politicians accountable. So this is not a failure of African publics by any means. Okay, so these are just, this is a protest from South Africa. I cut it off so I could put all three pictures in here, but she wants electricity and toilets and clinics and police. None of those sound entirely unreasonable as things to want in your life, functional. This guy, he's from Benin, so French is his first language. His sign says hardship is too much, which is kind of, I like that translation. These are some youth protesting, I believe in Burkina, and they want laws over politics. They're asking for rule of law. They're wanting corruption to stop. They're wanting it to be predictable. When you go to the court, you actually get a legal decision rather than the decision going to whoever was bribed. They also want, if someone at the top steals millions of dollars, they want that person to actually go to jail. I really like this sign. It says, "We are young, but we are not stupid." Oh, it was this sign. Oops, no. This is a voting line in South Africa. People complain about voting lines in this country. But these are some folks who are really working hard. They're spending a lot of their day, a lot of their time, a lot of their resources trying to make sure that democracy is working for them. So does democracy work? And the answer is, well, there's some mixed findings. There's a little bit of a question potential because poverty in Africa has persisted so long. You will find more studies that say that democracy isn't working in Africa, but I do think that for the most part it is. We have multiple studies that provide some pretty convincing evidence that democracy globally and in Africa has some pretty positive consequences. I really like this study because it's very easy to see just visually what's happening. So here, this is the change in infant mortality. Infant mortality is often used as sort of a singular measure of poverty because we assume that if you're a parent and your child is ill, that you will sacrifice everything you can possibly sacrifice to make sure that your child pulls through, right? That's just the instinctive parental reaction. So if children are dying below age 5 or below age 1, there was nothing left to sacrifice. And there was nothing for parents to do. Because if they had anything that they could do, they would have done it, right? And so we use infant mortality as a measure of extreme poverty. And if infant mortality is dropping, that's really good news. And what this shows, this is in African countries, all normalized around their year where they switched from being an autocracy to a democracy. And you can see that, generally speaking, while they're autocracies, dictatorships, infant mortality is kind of bopping around, but the changes aren't huge, right? And then once you normalize it and you put that first year of democracy, you almost immediately start to see infant mortality dropping. That's very good news. There's also evidence that democracy reduces corruption. That's very good news. It reduces poverty head count, the number of people who count as extremely poor. It often causes one thing that really happens is that leaders who want to be elected, one thing that parents really find frustrating is when they have to pay a fee to send their child to school. Not like a PTA fee, but like you have to pay tuition to go to elementary school in the government schools. And so one of the first things that a lot of leaders did when they were democratically elected was to remove those school fees. And so enrollment in primary education goes through the roof. There's some cost to that too. But there's a lot of things that democracy seems to be correlated with. This is the one piece of my work that I will show, and it shows a very similar pattern. So we have some good data based in surveys for lived poverty. And we essentially ask people, how often do you go without I didn't run the survey, I just use it. But the survey, you ask people, how often do you have to go without food, water, cash, medical care? All of those things that go into that $2 a day measure, right? We just ask them directly and we get their experiences. And it's pretty easy to show that when small changes, even small changes over time in democracy, so if a country becomes somewhat more democratic from one year to the next, using a measure that was developed by a professor here, by the way, Daniel Pemstein, it's a really good measure. You should use it in your research. But as democracy increases, the extremity of poverty goes down, right? So this is a scale. It goes from 0 to 5. And if you know how to read a regression, you can see there's some nice stars there. It's a negative coefficient. That means the severity of poverty is decreasing along with democracy. And the effect is quick in the sense that you can see the impacts happening a year or two after democracy improves. So in that sense, they're quick, but in another sense, they're slow because poverty is very deep. And poverty is a multifaceted issue that's hard to solve. And so to a certain extent, the change from democracy is quite slow. So if you don't know how to read a regression, well, and you don't even have enough information to read this regression anyway, but what these coefficients work out to is that if you had perfect democracy, it would take about 30 years for the average person in Africa to go from being below the extreme poverty threshold to being above it. Okay. First of all, being above the extreme poverty threshold is still really, really poor, right? It just means you're probably going to live until tomorrow. 30 years in this scheme of human history is nothing. However, that's most of someone's life, right? Do we want people, and people are justifiably not wanting to live the next 30 years of their lives dealing with this kind of poverty. And you might not want people to wait 30 years to allow democracy to sort of do its thing. The other problem is that this is a prediction based on perfect democracy. There's no country in the world that has perfect democracy. And the quality of democracy in most African countries, they're democracies in the sense that they have elections, but they're not democracies in the sense that we have them here. And I'm going to talk about one of the key differences between democracy in Africa and democracy here. So the change is going to be a lot slower in places where democracy is substantially flawed. So the result is that this is sort of a graph actually by recent Nobel Prize, some of the recent Nobel Prize winners. This is by Banerjee et al. And they're showing this is the share of poor people living in different types of democracies. So up here, these are perfect democracies. Well, really high quality, there's no perfect ones, but high quality countries with free and fair elections. They're competitive. There's really, there's not a one-party dominance, that kind of thing. There's really not very many poor people living in very advanced democracies. There's also not a lot of poor people living in true autocracies because there aren't very many true autocracies anymore. There really aren't that many countries where you just have a dictator who's openly a dictator and doesn't even try to hold elections or anything like that. Right? The vast majority of people live in these types of democracies that are sort of somewhat flawed. And in this case, we have countries that hold elections and they're reasonable elections, but it's one party dominant. There's really no guess about, there's no uncertainty about who's going to win. And these are moderately competitive elections, but we're still pretty sure that the incumbent's going to win. One of the key reasons why this happens, and one of the key problems with African democracy, it's not just African democracy, this is a problem with democracy in most places in the world except the advanced democracies, is something called clientelism. It's considered kind of a niche thing to study because we don't have it here anymore, but it's massively politically and economically impactful. And so you know what clientelism is. We used to call it the party machine, party bosses. We had it in Chicago, we had it in New York, we had it in lots of other places where there's a direct exchange between you and a political leader, that you vote for him, or at least don't rebel against him, right? You don't cause any trouble, you don't try to get him unelected. And in exchange, you get stuff, you get cash, you get booze, you get food, you get your Thanksgiving turkey, whatever it is that you need. You have this personal relationship with this clientelist boss. You can have material, you can get access to material goods that you need, and all you have to do is make sure that he stays in office, right? Nowadays, clientelism actually still looks quite similar in a lot of countries in the world. In some places, people are directly paid for voting. If you show up and you prove, you take a picture of your ballot maybe, and show them, and they'll come out, they'll give you some cash. Or maybe there'll be a rally and you come to attend the rally, and while you're at the rally, you get food and t-shirts and oil or salt, something like that. Or it happens in a lot of African countries, if your entire community votes the same way, you get a block vote for the guy who wins the election, you can have your school, or you can have your well, or you can have something else that you fairly desperately need. Sometimes when I describe this, people get confused because they're like, yeah, but we vote for politicians to give us stuff all the time, right? Like I vote for this guy because I want to see this policy or whatever else. But the difference is, if, for example, you need food stamps. So Biden is currently president, right? If you go to get food stamps because you need food stamps, they'll ask you a lot of questions about your income to make sure you qualify. But the question they won't ask you is, hey, did you vote for President Biden? They don't make you prove that you voted for the person who won the election. Clientelism, you would have to prove that you are a loyal supporter of the guy in power, or sorry, no food stamps for you. And as you can see, this is sort of, again, this is also VDEM, but this is, red is no clientelism. And you can see there actually aren't that many red countries. Blue, shades of blue in this kind of pinky color predominate most of the world. Clientelism is sort of the default nature of politics until you can figure out a way to fight it. And here's the problem with, there's lots of problems with clientelism. But one of the problems with clientelism is that it's really highly correlated with corruption. And there's a couple of reasons for it, but a key reason is, let's say you desperately need, or you anticipate that at some point in the future, you're going to be short of food, or you're going to be short of rent, Or your father's, you anticipate that your father's going to die and you really want to throw, you need to have a funeral for him, but you don't have any money for a funeral, right? You anticipate that you're going to need something and you don't have a social safety net. Your friends don't have any money. What you're going to do is make sure that the guy who's in power locally knows you have his support. You're going to vote for him. And then when you need something, he's going to give it to you. And that's nice. He's giving you stuff that you need, but that's pretty much your primary criterion for whether you support him and whether he's putting in place good policies, whether he's promoting business, whether he's in fact stealing most of the money that comes to him is not your primary concern, because you know that you're going to need money and your best way to get it is to vote for this guy, even though you actually don't like him or think he's a very good politician. So it can be kind of hard to vote against these guys because essentially they're bribing voters to support them. So it makes it hard to solve some of these bigger political issues with democracy because you're interfering with people's ability to vote out the politicians who aren't serving them. Similarly, there's a very strong negative correlation between the existence of clientelism and policies that would actually help people get out of poverty. Right? They're calling it redistribution here, but it's any kind of pro-poor policy that would actually help people by maybe giving them a social safety net, or maybe giving them training, or giving them the services, the roads, or whatever else that they need. And there's two reasons for that. One is that it's hard to spend money on public services when you're spending all your money on voting bribes, right? So every dollar that you give to someone at a rally is a dollar you can't put towards a road or a well or a school. But the other more insidious issue with clientelism is it depends on poverty. If people don't need things from you as the local leader or the government, they're not gonna vote for you because they're not over a barrel, right? So the clientelism only works when your voters are poor and desperate and they're willing to trade their vote to you for usually very small and insignificant things, right? Once people become members of the middle class and they can meet their own needs themselves, clientelism doesn't work anymore because people are like, I'm not going to give you my vote for a bag of salt. Why would I do that? Right? Whereas someone else might be like, I am desperately in need of a bag of salt. Yes, I will give you my vote. That's the best choice I can make right now. Both choices are entirely rational and reasonable, but the government really likes the poor person being desperate. What does that mean? The government has absolutely no incentive. And in fact, they have a disincentive to do anything that would permanently solve poverty, because now they've just lost their point of leverage over the voting population. So you actually, in a clientelist system, have the government deliberately trying to keep people poor rather than trying to get them out of poverty. And oftentimes you'll give what we call consumables. I don't know why, you all know what consumables are, but you'll give things that can easily be used up, because if it was like, you might avoid actually trying to give people a school. Because once you build a school, you can't take the school back, right? And then once people are educated, they might be middle class. You'd much rather give them $5, which will be gone instantly. And then next election cycle, they're yours for the picking again. So this clientelism is also a trap, much like poverty. It's very hard to get out of. And it's hard for voters, even collectively, to break out of this cycle, because if you're going to need something and this is your best way to get it, clientelism makes sense, right? And particularly if you think your neighbors are all voting this way too. Imagine you're having trouble making it through the week and one politician says, hey, I'm going to give you $10. And one politician says, hey, in about 5 years, I'll have finished constructing this road to your village. I would really like a road to my village, but I'm still going to vote for the guy who's going to give me $10 because I need that $10 way before I need a road, right? And also, in 5 years, I mean, a lot can go wrong in 5 years. Maybe we're not getting a road at all. Okay, so clientelism is an incredibly hard trap to break out of. And much like with poverty, one of the ways to solve, there are multiple ways to solve it, but one of the ways to solve it is to stick a wedge in right here and to make it so that people don't need the sort of kind of dinky goods and services that politicians are providing in exchange for the vote. And so people have provided cash, vouchers, services. This was actually not in Africa, this was in Latin America, but they put a cistern over the water because it turned out that in this country, one of the things that politicians were giving people was clean water. And so they came in and they said, oh, we're going to put a cistern, we're going to keep the water clean, and now you can have clean water and vote however you want, right? Another thing that's a little less obvious is roads. if you can get a road and people can get themselves around the country easily, then local politicians lose a lot of their leverage, right? Because they're like, you have to vote for me if you want a school in this community. And people say, oh, well, I can just put my kid on the bus. They'll just go to school in the next community. What's the problem, right? Whereas if there's no road or it's a very poor quality road, they're kind of stuck. And they either don't have a school or they vote for this guy. Same thing with clinics, banks, whatever it is. If you can get people easy transport, you can break down a lot of this clientelism because people can go to other politicians who aren't trying to scam them out of their votes. All right. So what do we do? And so this is the point where I talk about what we do. I think, yeah, we should have enough time. Is where, what kinds of things could we're not African governments here. We can shout at African governments all we want, but we're not them and they don't care what we think. What can we as outsiders potentially do to maybe stick a wedge in this and allow people essentially to vote the way they would prefer to vote? So we're helping democracy work for them by making them less vulnerable to politicians who are trying to take advantage of them, essentially. All right. One option that was really popular, and in fact, one of the guys who was a big name in microloans won the Nobel Peace Prize, is microloans. Really a good idea in theory. So we think people maybe they want to start a business, but they don't have any surplus capital, right? That was the whole issue. It's hard to get out and they don't need very much, right? Like maybe you want to start a sewing business and you need a sewing machine. Or maybe you want to start a roadside cafe and it would be much better if you could buy a bag of rice wholesale, but you can't afford to buy a whole bag of rice wholesale because you've got like 10 cents extra at the end of the day. So we can give people these tiny little loans and then they can use it, they can start their business, they can turn a profit and they can give the money back. Perfect. Great in theory. It does not work. And there's a couple of reasons it doesn't work. One is that it turns out running a business is hard, particularly running a business in a place where everybody is poor and there's not a whole lot of demand. It's hard to, and particularly if you want to start a business with $10 or $50 or $100, everyone around you, I mean, that's not a business that's terribly hard to start, right? And a community can only support so many seamstresses or so many roadside cafes. So a lot of these businesses fail. A lot of people are like, I don't want to start a business. I want to get my kids medication. And so they go and they consume it. I think that's an entirely sensible thing to do with money. However, it doesn't turn a profit. It makes it hard. And then, so people can't repay these loans because they're loans, right? And if you're not setting a successful business, you don't have anything to pay the loan back with. So some of these they usually don't increase income. They usually don't increase profit. They do increase indebtedness, which is actually sort of the opposite of helpful. And a lot of people can anticipate that this is going to be a problem. They can anticipate that they're not going to be able to pay back that loan. They don't want to be on the hook for it. And so uptake for these kinds of loans is actually really low. You can go into communities and people just won't, they're like, no, in what world would I be able to pay that back, right? Much like many of you, I imagine, unless you were desperate, would avoid a payday loan, right? Because we all know that that's going to be incredibly hard to pay back. All right. That's my very professional way of saying don't do that. Microloan, similar to a microloan, but without the indebtedness, is just giving people the money and saying you could use some money. You're not going to be able to pay it back. I know you're not going to be able to pay it back. Here's some money, right? Cash transfers. They're called cash transfers in the development economics literature. Typically, I mean, that's what a welfare payment is, right? If you get TANF checks, you have received a cash transfer. You've just been given some money and you can spend it how you see fit. No, even this policy is not perfect, right? So there's a lot of analyses of these and we can see these red ones. These blue ones are places where things got better. These red ones are places where things actually got worse, right? And so one of them is on employment, which is not surprising. If you give people cash transfers, they don't work as many hours because they don't need to. Although sometimes it increases employment. Why? Because now people can sit for a minute and take maybe like a week or two off and actually find a better job, right? So actually there are some positive employment effects of cash transfers in some studies. I don't actually know what empowerment is. That's a really unhelpful outcome variable, but anyway, so they are mixed. A lot of times they don't have any measurable effect whatsoever, but for the most part, generally speaking, they do seem to be helping, and they do seem to be helping with, wait, oh, did I lose? Wait, what happened? Oh no, I have the next slide, okay. They do seem to be helping with the monetary poverty, which is if people don't have money and you give them money, and then you say, hey, do you have money? Now they have money because you gave them money. All right, so anyway, if you are interested in cash transfers, and I'm gonna recommend these guys for a reason. Oh, one of the things that wasn't on here that's an obvious risk if you know anything about economic theory is inflation, right? And so in communities, particularly where a lot of people have been given this money, we do have indicators that sometimes we get inflation, the price of goods goes up, it sort of erodes the value of the cash transfer, but also it makes it hard for the people that didn't get the cash transfer because they didn't get the transfer and now all their basic goods are more expensive, right? But that doesn't happen every time. And so if you're interested in cash transfers, I want to recommend this organization. It's called givedirectly.org, and it is run by economists. Economists are flawed. So the fact that it's run by economists may be good, may be bad. They know more than most, but the thing that's really, political scientists are flawed too. The thing that's nice about this though, is that there are always people analyzing it. They're analyzing their own stuff. They're putting out their data. Other economists are analyzing what they're doing all the time. And so they're watching very closely for these adverse effects. And they're trying all the time to figure out how to run and allocate these cash transfers in a way that maximizes the benefits and minimizes the poor outcomes. Most public policy, most kind of charities are not analyzing and monitoring themselves nearly as closely as this organization is. So if you think you want to be charitable, and you think cash transfers might help, but you're worried about these unintended harms, I would suggest them just because there's so many people watching the outcomes of this organization at all times. And so if something goes wrong, and there are people that I trust that if something goes wrong, they will actually fix it. They won't just go, we tried. Okay. But one last thing that you can, that matters that I think isn't always obvious to people is remittances. And so remittances are the things where people from various countries come to a different country like the US or whatever else, and they work and they make a lot of money, often don't make a lot of money by American standards, but sometimes they do, but they make an awful lot of money by the standards of their home country. And so they send back, they live frugally, they send back portions of their money to their people in their community. And the people in their community use it however they want in a way that would be most useful to them. And it turns out that remittances, actually, there's enough money flowing into Africa from African migrants in the US or in Europe, it actually rivals the amount of money that's coming in with aid. And remittances work just like, I mean, they're this wedge, right? So what I didn't say directly is that we know, we have good evidence that all of these things start to break down clientelism. We know that this works. It's just a matter of how we want people to get money. But remittances work the same way. So this is a really nice study from some former colleagues of mine that show that this is hard to interpret, but essentially what this shows is that in places where people don't like the government they've got, these are the people that would like to vote against the government. They think the government is not doing a good job, probably because the government isn't doing a good job. They think the government isn't doing a good job, but they've been sort of constrained until now because if they made too big of a stink, they were going to get cut off from all of the resources that they needed. And it turns out if you take these folks who oppose the government and you send in remittances, they get money from outside, from their kin or their friends who are outside the country, you see a dramatic increase in protests. Protests may be not what we want, but it's indication that people are now feeling free to rebel against a government that isn't serving their interests. And the same thing happens with their vote share. So in places, it doesn't work in true democracy, in true autocracies, but in sort of these flawed democracies where there's elections, but it's not really very competitive, in places where remittances are flowing most heavily, we see people suddenly being willing to vote out the incumbent. Vote share changes by 15%. Do you know what? So as a political scientist, I can tell you that a change in vote share of 15% is unheard of, right? Usually in the US, we're talking, like an intervention will change people's votes by 0.5%, maybe if it's really effective. Actually taking all of these people essentially who were voting for the incumbent. They didn't like him. He wasn't serving them well, but they were voting for him because they had to, so they didn't get cut off from the services they needed. The remittances flowed in. They were able to buy those services. They were able to send their kids to school. They were able to use a private clinic. They were able to start a business or buy land or whatever it was they were doing with their remittances. They don't need the government anymore. And now they can vote out this guy who's been screwing up their economy this whole time, right? I am really proud of Fargo because we are actually one of the top locations for African migrants in the US. And I really like that. Also, because if you have not tried the African restaurants in town, you really should, because they're very good. And I spend a lot of money at the African restaurants in town. And this is like, so the thing about remittances is you don't have to do anything, right? It's not your money. You don't have to give money to give directly. You don't have to, it's not your tax dollars that are going to fund these remittances. It's solving the problem, but it's not your money. You're looking confused. So it's migrants who come, it's African migrants who come here and work and send the money back. You have had to give none of your money whatsoever, except maybe by employing someone. But what you do have to do is make sure that people can get here, right? So this happened a few years ago in Bismarck. People were really concerned about the number of African refugees coming into the state, and they tried to reduce the number and tried to keep people out. And other people came and said, no, we don't want to do that. We want people to be able to come here, right? From a policy perspective, if you care about Africa, if you care about the political function of Africa, if you care about the economic function of African countries, you should be wanting more immigration coming in. This should be something where you should be voting welcome, not only for whatever justice or social issues you have, but also because remittances are incredibly effective at changing the politics and the economics of the receiving country. And in fact, that's how, when I was a kid, that was a long time ago, when I was a kid, Mexico was a very, very poor country. And just in my lifetime, it is now a upper middle income country. And almost all of that has come from Mexican workers coming to the US, sending money back home. Mexico has also become dramatically more democratic. And the elections have become much more competitive in Mexico because of those remittances coming from people working in the US and sending money home, mean that people did not need to be dependent on the government and did not need to vote for the government. And so they actually voted their conscience instead. Okay. And so this is my policy recommendation for something you can do. If you don't want to give up your money, you can advocate to make sure that people are able to come in.
So that when
okay.
That, you're not
yeah.
Yeah. So really good job, very interesting. I just want to challenge one thing in there. So is there a piece missing in here though? Because I mean, I think maybe what about the rules of the game, the rules in place, kind of predictable rules? So for example, why wouldn't microloans be successful? Because of the stuff that McGott was talking about, it is very cumbersome to start a business. You're married to your employees, if you hire them, all those kinds of things. If those rules are not taken care of, then people can't be successful by starting their own business. And so don't you have to solve that before you go?
Of course.
But and then like cash transfers, isn't that just that's just a temporary fix, right? It's not gonna fix long term.
Well, first of all, we actually do have evidence from many cases that cash transfers have permanently solved poverty for families. So not in Africa, we don't have a lot of good evidence, but in Latin America, cash transfers, broad spread, essentially the social safety net, has actually dramatically reduced intergenerational transfer of poverty because people who have surplus income also send their kids to school. And so then their kids have education and they're not working at age 12 and whatever else. So there is some evidence that cash transfers can do that. You're right that the kind of, like if I'm giving someone $20, that's not going to solve, that's not solving their poverty. But here's the thing, this is what McGott was talking about. These are the risks. Right. And the risk that she's talking about, rule of law. So what he's talking about is rule of law, which means there's laws and people follow them and they're predictable and they don't ask you for a bribe and they don't change it based on their feelings that day. And the rich and the poor are all subject to the same rules. And so it's much more predictable. It's easy to solve a business. There's no chance that someone's going to come and take your business out from under you. Right. And so this is what we're talking about here. And my claim is that we can't solve, this is a political problem. I mean, it has economic impacts and it affects economic policy, but it's a political problem. The reason that these policies are in place is because they benefit the people in power. That's why pretty much any laws are in place. And rule of law, economic freedom, whatever policy you want, you don't just, I mean, you can shout it all you want, but policies are put in place by politicians. Their laws are written and then they're enforced by the state or not enforced by the state as the case may be. And that's a political problem. And so what I'm saying is, let's say you want those policies. Let's say you think those would be the best policies. Probably most people in African countries would agree with you. People in African countries also don't want to be living under these kinds of arbitrary rules. The question is, why haven't they been able to get leaders who don't do that? And my answer is, well, because these democracies are flawed. There's also repression, there's also intimidation, there's also all sorts of other things. But a big one is clientelism, and cash transfers can't solve poverty permanently, but they can, even a temporary one, can give someone the freedom they need to vote against a corrupt politician who's putting in place harmful policies, right? So cash transfers here, I'm presenting as a political solution, not an economic solution. Not a direct economic solution, right? We're going to solve the politics to get better leaders. Okay, am I supposed to pick? Jim raised his hand in the middle. He has something to say.
So how much of an impact there is in financial innovation, things like mobile money, things like cryptocurrency, XRP, I know that was a big ripple network in my neighborhood, remittances. How much is that impacting Africa?
So mobile phones are massive. Like I would say, oh, one thing I actually forgot to say that's actually really important. So did anyone wonder why clientelism fell in the US? None of you wondered? What? Yeah, it was the Industrial Revolution. The government wasn't going to solve client, right? The government isn't going to be like, here, let's give you some money so you can vote against me. It was the Industrial Revolution, which sort of just happened, and the governments got completely snowed by it, and suddenly incomes went through the roof. And then the government couldn't control people anymore. And so we see that, and that's what killed clientelism in the US. I mean, so we could, will technology eventually end clientelism in Africa? It will. The question is, I just don't know when. And so I don't know if people feel comfortable waiting for technology to solve the problem. That said, mobile phones are massive. They have caused such an improvement in quality of life for so many people in ways that are obvious and ways that are not obvious. I'm just like, it's awesome. I truly don't know anything about cryptocurrency and remittances, except that it is possible for politicians to control remittances a little bit by futzing with the exchange rates, right? So if you have to go and take your American dollars to the bank and the government sets the exchange rates, the government can like skim off the top a little bit from those remittances. I don't know enough about crypto to know if it solves that problem. It might. And I don't know if you can take your crypto, I don't know enough about how people store it and if it's secure. One thing that is definitely missing in a lot of African countries that mobile phones have helped with, and maybe crypto, I don't know, has helped with, there's not a lot of banking infrastructure. And so a lot of people, one of the reasons that you don't have a savings account is that there's no place to put a savings account. And a lot of people like store money in a jar under their bed, but it turns out that anybody can walk into your house and steal the money. So like you have an incentive not to save because there's no guarantee that someone won't walk off with it, right? And so mobile banking has done a lot so that you can have a bank that's anywhere and you can get all your, and like there's just like a little kiosk in your town and the mobile people send them money and then they pay you. And so it's a savings account without having to have a bank in your community. So maybe I just don't know. I'm sure there's research on it, but I'm not a crypto person and I don't entirely understand. So it might, you could do some research. Yeah, I had a student question then yeah.
And living totally different social and cultural standards, and then now you're putting them in a country that they don't understand. They don't often speak the language. They don't often understand how.
Hold on, one second. So a huge portion of Africa was colonized by European countries. So
at least refugees in Fargo, at least in Red Wars.
Okay.
I can speak more specifically the refugees.
Okay.
They come in, they don't speak the language,
Mhm.
they have no idea that he's scamming them. Because that's
Sure. Right.
They come in to get medication, and then they think that you're scamming.
Right.
And so, and they also like are willing to steal because they think anything left out is stolen. How do you fix those kinds of things when you're wanting to advocate for something like this?
People adapt. I mean, I also, because I've also lived, so it goes the reverse, right? I've been a migrant. I've lived in African countries for several years in total. It's very different in African countries. I've adapted. It took me about 5 months. I mean, there are things like people do have trauma responses, right? Like if you've been severely traumatized, if you've been assaulted repeatedly, if you've been a victim of war, that will have indelible impacts. But people are traumatized here too, right? And so people do adapt. And actually there is some, I don't know off the top of my head about your particular question about Grand Forks or whatever else. Yeah. I mean, I do think one thing I like about Fargo is that we do have our school systems, because I used to be a K-12 teacher, so I'm very interested in the education system as well. Our teachers here and our schools have done a really good job of developing classes for people who come in at age 8, 10, 15 and have never had school before, ever, right? And so like they're having to start from scratch, at least in a Western model. They know lots of things, but it's not the things that a Western school would teach them. And so they're potentially having to start from scratch. And I think our schools have done a really good job of saying, we're going to meet these kids where they are, and we're going to teach them what they need to know. As for people, like the only research I know on this is on directly on this is, well, there's some other stuff about people assimilating and lots of things. Generally, assimilation is often a problem because of pushback from the people who are already there, not the willingness of the migrants to adapt. But I do know there's some research on like people coming into Oxford University, coming from countries that are very corrupt, right? Where that's just the norm. That's how you get things done. People don't want to pay bribes, but they do because they have to, right? And when they first get to Oxford, we can put them in a lab and have them play games, and they will play these games. They will cheat in the games and they will, right. By the time they graduate, that's just gone. They've adapted to the norms of the game. There's no problem. There's I mean, it's culture. We learn and people learn. And I change my behavior when I'm in Africa. I'm much more relaxed in some ways. I'm much more wary in some ways. And I adapt, and then I come home and I adapt back.
Just one really short
Okay.
question.
I mean, I'm willing to stay however long, but yeah.
So I'm going to be in the place where corruption is very practiced. So I think it's, and I kind of understand that corruption is bad, right? But the problem is that we need to distinguish between corruption that committed by low-ranking officials,
Yes.
private officials. When people talk about level corruption, all of this development agencies that go there, they talk about letting it happen for low-ranking officials.
Like petty corruption. Yeah.
And then if you talk to them, like they say, I want to be considered from the bar.
Sure.
And now you make it hard for me to drop for that I'm not going to go to work. I'm going to let all this paperwork. So it's becoming inefficient. So, and those development agency doesn't want to be with the big guy who locked out all the money because hey, who want to fight not get this income. That's
true, but you know who does want it? So his argument is that petty corruption is like your nurses, your police officers, whatever else. So teachers, yeah. So I charge you to come to my class, and if you don't pay a bribe, I'm just not going to show up today, right? And there's arguments that people are doing that because they're otherwise not getting paid, or they're getting paid an amount that is just silly, and so they're, this is their income essentially. There's also pressure. So there was a really interesting study in Ghana where they increased the quality of police officers. So they went and got people who had degrees and who scored really highly on tests, because they were like, well, these guys won't need to be corrupt. And it turned out they were more corrupt because they were better at their job. And the job they had been assigned by their superiors was to collect bribes. That was their job. And they were very good at it because they were very smart. And so corruption went up. And I agree that the world, and I have so many stories about the World Bank and their willingness to enable corruption, particularly at high levels, and also their sort of willful blindness to it, right? But you know who does vote against corruption, who does control corruption at the high level, is voters, right? That's where corruption, that's because you have to solve it at the top first, right? the only people who the people at the top are accountable to is the population. And so it turns out that if you can give information to the population that they can use, right? Like who's the most corrupt? How much are they stealing? Blah, 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 blah. You will actually, if people can get information on who the bad actors are and who sort of the medium actors are and who the good actors are at the top, they will in fact, particularly if you can solve some of these clientelism issues, they will in fact vote against corruption at the top. People aren't dumb, they know what's happening, right? And they know that the problem is at the top. And so if they can nail it down, they will vote out, particularly if they're not being bribed to vote for those same people.
We're gonna have to cut it. It's 11 o'clock, so you can ask.
I'm fine to stay. I don't mind.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.